Hello, everyone. We're honored to introduce the insightful and brilliant mind of Stephen Lacey, researcher and founder of The Outsiders, which he likes to describe as a bunch of misfits shaking up insights, cultural understanding, and the wisdom of the crowds. True to the name, Steve prides The Outsiders' way of conducting research outside the margins. Perhaps the reason he's known as an insight specialist is because he's always on a mission to challenge convention. He'll be in conversation with Joe Burns, strategy director at Mother UK. His work speaks volumes about his in depth understanding of consumer culture and the art of persuasion. From selling insurance comparison with a twerking businessman to hot pants to deploying the cast of Love Island to gate crash nights with a takeaway. We cannot wait to get a glimpse into the way you both see the world. Over to you guys.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic to be here, and it's good morning in England and good afternoon, I think, in other kind of places. So what I'm going to take you through is a presentation that myself and Joe have been working on over the last couple of months during the kind of COVID lockdown. And essentially, we've kind of developed a model to kind of segment UK audiences in the kind of essence of what would be described as a kind of culture war that's going on both in the UK and the US. Initially, it's a UK kind of focus, but we know that it can be applied to other kind of markets. And we're very excited about it. It's been picked up by some of the leading kind of political strategists in the UK, as well as activists and most of the major brands, and of kind of using it or looking at it to think about how they think about kind of brands. But before I kind of start, I'm going to do a little whirlwind tour on kind of trends. Hopefully try and teach you some kind of new ones, because I know there's been kind of quite a lot of kind of trend organisations kind of spreading their kind of worth. I'm then going to talk about Britishness, and then we're going to take you through a model we initially developed, and then with experts, including some leading kind of historians and kind of some political commentators, and then we're going to take you on about how that audience is kind of sized. So I need to share my screen, but I think I disabled. So can I share my screen? Sorry, guys. I think I'm disabled from sharing my kind of screen.
And you should have
brilliant, excellent. The wonderful life of Zoom. So okay, so this is kind of called the state of the nation. So let me take you into full screen mode. Can everyone see that? So I think a good place to start is kind of pre-COVID. A lot of people are out there at the moment doing kind of COVID kind of trends, but to be honest, I don't think there was any new trends through kind of COVID. I think what COVID did was it just accelerated trends and acted as a kind of COVID. So I think we need to go back in kind of time pre-COVID to understand some of the trends that were going on, and I will then talk about how they've been kind of amplified in a kind of COVID kind of world. The first thing that we've seen, and we've been seeing this for the last couple of years in the UK, and we're seeing it in other countries, seeing it in Poland, seeing it in the US, is a polarity of kind of thinking. So what you're seeing is some big kind of conflict points between environmentalists and deniers, centrists versus kind of populists, globalists versus kind of nationalists.
Steve, I don't think the screen sharing. I think you're going to have to do it not on full screen. Sometimes happens.
Okay. So thanks, Joe. So can you see it now? No?
I think you need to share screen again, but not put it on present mode in the.
Can you all see that? So hold on. Share screen. Thanks, Joe. Can we see? Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen. Steve,
okay, excellent. So what we're seeing in the UK is this polarity of thinking, and people, kind of a diversity of different kind of topics. So environmentalists versus deniers. You're seeing liberalism versus authoritarianism, progressives versus traditionalists, In the UK, we had a Brexit versus Remain, which is still kind of transcending at the moment. And then some of the smaller things and differences you'll see is a city versus smaller towns, meat eaters versus vegetarian, and experts versus anti-intellectualism. So this has been developing over the last few years. This is quite un-British. So Britain's quite a trading nation. So we tend to like the kind of the centre ground. So we don't like these tension points. What's been happening since COVID has been kind of accentuated. So you have a lot of consumers and the population in worried and concerned. And what you've got is a battle of ideas. So I would say we're actually entering the biggest battle of ideas that we've probably had since the 1980s, maybe even the 1930s. So who will win that? Will that be the liberalism, or will it be authoritarianism? Will it be the traditionalists and progressives? Is a big thing. And this is where I think a lot of focus needs to go. The next thing we saw a lot in the UK was pre-COVID, the present was very, very tough. So for the ordinary person, life was difficult. You couldn't get it was hard to get a house, you couldn't afford, you had wider social networks, but it often meant that you didn't have so many kind of friends through that. And everything was essentially focused on the kind of now and just how do you kind of get by. In a COVID age, this is going to get even worse. So where the present was tough, the future is essentially, pardon my French, is going to be shit for many audiences, and people already losing their jobs, being redundant, wondering how they're going to pay their bills. The next thing you saw was a trust void. So people in the UK are not trusting politicians, they're not trusting the media, and there's a feeling that establishment is kind of fading. We're seeing this accentuated more and more. I've done a lot of work recently around kind of media and media trust, and people in a COVID age will stop watching the news, people have been stopped buying kind of newspapers. The worrying thing is that gap's being filled by conspiracy theories. So I did a recent bit of Quoll, and out of 75 people that I spoke to, quite a large Quoll study, only 2 believed in the official version that COVID had come from the markets in China. Most people thought it had come either from a Chinese lab, and a few people from 5G. So conspiracy theories are starting to fill this kind of trust void. Since 2008, what we've been seeing since the economic crash is a real kind of lack of kind of dreams. So the amount of times I've done research with people and I was like, what's your future aspirations? And people are like, well, I don't really have anything. I just want to kind of survive and get through the kind of present. What you see is dreams in the form of aspirations. In year X, I'm going to do this, year Y, year Z, etc., have kind of disappeared. And they've essentially been replaced by fantasy. So you're seeing the rise of kind of superheroes, you're seeing the rise of kind of Disney kind of films, you're seeing the rise of kind of Hollywood kind of glamour that's very kind of unreachable. We're seeing in the West, and we're seeing the opposite in China and other markets, but we're seeing the shift from the I to the we. So in many ways, the I is still very important, the sense of individualism. So youth are seeing themselves as personal brands with KPIs. You have the rise of entrepreneur culture, the showcasing of kind of the super ego, but the we is coming more and more to the kind of fore. Rising kind of political activism, a lot of questions about capitalism, and a pullback to community. What's happened in the COVID age is we've seen this community really being heightened. So people are really looking out for their neighbours, real kind of communication on local kind of Facebook groups. How can we help each other? And that sense of community and the collective coming much more to the kind of fore. Seeing a rejection of perfection. So in the past, you kind of had in the narrative of kind of film, often the prince and princess relationship. Now, when you look at film, you see much more of a reflection of reality. You're not just going to meet a guy or a girl and get married and live happily ever after. You're seeing good, in the past we had good and bad characters, evil and kind of good. Now HBO are the master of this. What you see is characters with a lot of kind of depth. They're not good, they're not bad. Think kind of Game of Thrones is a classic example of that. The characters we like have a lot of depth to them. They don't show good or kind of evil sides. In the past we had Supermen in kind of film, but now what you see is you see superheroes who kind of bleed. So Daredevil is a classic example of that. HBO. I've never seen a superhero get beaten up so much. But even James Bond, which is in many ways is the embodiment of kind of Britishness and masculinity in England as well. What we're seeing is that he now kind of bleeds. When I was growing up, celebrities were very much kind of gods. So we kind of, I had big posters, don't tell anyone, of kind of Prince and kind of Madonna on my kind of wall. Then that kind of dissipated, celebrities as God dissipated in the West and in the UK, and you got image production. So things like X Factor, where you get Dorothy, she would look a mess, she'd appear on TV, and 5 days later she was the most amazing kind of singer. Then you kind of got to the place recently of the kind of ordinary guy, where we moved away from image production. So Ed Sheeran embodies that kind of guy you kind of go to school with, a bit of a kind of nerd. That's now been accentuated into the concept of weirdos. So Lewis Capaldi is a fantastic example of that. They're just messy, they're chaotic. They're the kind of guy who never would have gone to school, and if they did ever go to school, they'd just turn up in a complete and utter mess. When you look at political culture and spin doctors, you see a similar kind of thing. So under Tony Blair, you saw image consultants. It was very, very polished. It's very about suits and kind of very kind of pristine kind of imagery, and how can you make the narrative and kind of shift the narrative. That's kind of shifted now, political commentator, and Dominic Cummings in the UK is a good example of this. It's quite messy, so he kind of looks messy. He wants to recruit weirdos and kind of mavericks. Whether you like him or not, he's playing very much into these codes. We had an obsession with kind of wags and kind of that's kind of footballers' kind of wives. Now that's kind of gone away, and now it's very much focused on talent in your own kind of right. When we look at active rebellion, so we've been seeing quite a lot of rebellion in the UK. So that could be from a kind of soft and gentle rebellion, like turning your phone off at the kind of weekend to escape from society, through to kind of behaviour change rebellion. So I'm not eating meat, I'm caring for the kind of environment, through to what we see in the UK as youth rebellion, children not going to school and taking days off to protest about kind of climate change, to the breaking of taboos. I think Bodyform, who's one of the clients I work for, does that very, very well in women's space around kind of periods and kind of blood kind of normal, to performative. And I see a lot of this, and this is very much about, we're at the Remain protest or we're at the Brexit protest, and it's like, what's the best board I can put up so I get on Instagram or I get into The Guardian? And I think the last one is just cutting off from social expectations. So that idea of just not getting involved in the conversations that everyone is having at the moment. However, what we are seeing is a comeback of tradition. And even in Gen Z and millennials, so I wrote a big paper globally. So this is more globally, but what you're seeing is tradition making a comeback. And with Gen Z and millennials, what you're seeing is a magic third. So there's a third of people that are moving away from the concept of kind of diversity and progression, and they're playing very much into the traditional kind of codes. And for them, there would be a sense of religion coming back. There'd be against LGBTQ. There's that whole idea of the cult of the kind of strong man. This idea that we're in a world of liberal totalitarianism, that we're being told what to do and how to kind of think, and really kind of pushing back. And that's something I think we have to be careful and kind of watch. So what about Britishness? So let's talk. I'm going to talk about the working class. So it doesn't matter how much you kind of get away from it, you can't get away from it in England. We are a class-based society. And I'm going to talk about the white working class, because they're the audience that is probably kind of most connected to kind of Britishness in many kind of ways. So what do they think of kind of Britishness? So for them, Britishness means everything. So this is an audience that can't look to the future, because the future looks horrific for them. They know that the future is going to be really, really difficult. They're very much stuck in the present, but the present's incredibly kind of tough. So they need to look back to the past, and the past makes them feel safe. And the past is an anchor that kind of protects them. And this is really, really important, because the more times get difficult, the more someone needs to go back to the past. You're behavioural scientists, but you'll know this well. So as kind of caveman, we're programmed to look for new waters and new foods, but that new thing can kind of kill us. So we have a constant tension between the new and the kind of familiar. I would argue for this audience, when times get tough, they ignore the new and they shift very much back to the kind of the familiar. And they endorse Britishness and Englishness, and they flip it around in the same kind of way, because it makes them feel safe and it's secure. It's just familiarity They're very proud to be British, and they're secure in the strength and power of the past and romantic about the past. So there's a lot of kind of romanticism about what the past is and what the past can bring. People say, can you define that time? I think the best example is probably a kind of a Hovis kind of advert. It's a black and white advert set in a village where everyone knows everyone and everyone kind of gets on, that kind of comeback of the kind of community. And Britishness is such a secure anchor in their lives because it's one thing that can't be taken away. So you can take away these people's jobs, you can take away their livelihoods, you can take away their house, but Britishness is the one thing that can't be taken away from this audience. So it's vital, which is why when you had the Black Lives Matter protest, this is an audience that got very upset about the tax on the kind of statues, because it felt like it's an attack on the past, and it's a past that in a difficult time makes them feel safe and secure. And they were especially upset by the tax on Winston Churchill. There's a feeling with this audience that Britishness is under attack, so they think it will kind of die out. They get upset that other countries' festivals are celebrated more than their own. There's a feeling that they're branded racist for kind of supporting their kind of their country, and they feel that those in power dislike kind of Britishness and aren't passing it kind of on. So they're very defensive about Britishness and what Britishness is. They're also a little bit disappointed in the current social order. So Prince Andrew, there's been some sexual kind of allegations, I'll say allegations around him. They were upset about law and order in the context of Black Lives Matter. They're disappointed that they felt they overplayed their kind of hand. And the army, there's some been bullying things. So some of the big things that they really kind of trust, institutions, they feel have been let down. Got some other kind of views on kind of Britishness. So for global citizens, so in many ways the UK is divided into two kind of audience. You have hyper local, and then you have those what you call kind of global citizens, which don't really see themselves as citizens so much UK, but citizens of the kind of world. For these kind of people, Britishness and Englishness means very, very little. So for them, it's about racism, it's Union Jacks flying from the house, it's kind of very old-fashioned and outdated and has aspects of kind of colonialism associated with it. What you see in contrast is that some ethnic minorities in the UK embrace Britishness and Englishness, and they could often say it's better than potentially their home. So they might have come from kind of Hungary, for instance, and they talk about that the UK is somewhere that's embracing democracy, tolerance, and kind of rule of kind of law. And they appreciate those kind of values of kind of Britishness. But some ethnic minorities can feel invisible from the representation within the British square. So the Muslim community is a very good example of that. I did some groups with Muslim communities, and I said, who's your heroes? And they turned around and went kind of quiet. And someone said, Amir Khan, who's a boxer many years ago. And someone else said, Nadia from a TV program called Great British Bake Off. So they struggled very much to think about kind of heroes that kind of represented them. Also, when it comes to the media, the representation of Muslims tends to be either very kind of extreme, or it tends to be very, very kind of liberal and not much in between. Some ethnic minorities are finding the cards heavily stacked against them, and you're seeing this very much from Black British kind of perspective, where they talk about having less opportunity to succeed. They would like overall the statues they find them offensive of the statues of slave traders in the UK, and they think the police are generally institutionally kind of racist. Now I'm going to take you some UK kind of code. So there's a history behind this. About 3 years ago, just after Brexit, a very, very smart sematician, can't recommend him more highly, called Chris Arling, developed a quadrant of UK British kind of codes. And I was really inspired about that. So I kind of, from that inspiration, I've looked at that model and kind of further developed it in my own kind of way. And I'm going to take you through what this kind of stands for. We then explored this with some kind of historians and also some kind of political scientists to really make sure that it kind of felt representative. And really, we have kind of two kind of dimensions. So on one hand, we have traditionalism, and on the other side, we have kind of progressiveness. So that's a quadrant one. Now, that could be debatable. because some people could say that traditionalism actually is kind of progression. And a great example of that was in 78, I think it's 78, 79, after the Iranian Revolution. A lot of ethnographers were doing work across the Middle East, and they suddenly discovered a lot of women were now in the full kind of burqa. And those women, when they were kind of being interviewed, were saying this isn't traditionalism, this isn't progressiveness. But I'm using it in the Western terminology. I also think and strongly believe that progressiveness and traditionalism is history, and that's a fundamental battle of history, with the next two dimensions, which is the elite on one hand, and then on the other hand is the mass. And I think that's the other two battles. So we looked at the two biggest battles in kind of history, we kind of put them together in a codal kind of index. So what are those kind of UK kind of codes? So if we look at the kind of mass traditional, they're an audience which is very much about it's very much about protecting social order. It's looking back to the past. It's about security and working classness, and it's often rooted, not totally, in white British communities. It's a sense of looking back and being safe. The next quadrant is elite traditional, and that's about kind of protecting order. It's about domination of kind of culture, looking back to the past in a paternalistic way, and it's very much based around upper classness. We then have elite progressives. So this again is like, it's in conflict in many ways with the elite traditional. But similar, it dominates culture, but it's about gently changing the order from within. It's about being modernistic, individualism, but still with a sense of paternalism. And for this side, it's very much, I'd argue, about defending liberalism and the concept of liberalism and capitalism as it is at the moment. The next group, we have mass progressives. They're about gently changing the order. Like mass traditionals, they want an easy life, but it's very much rooted in kind of modernism and security and kind of working. We then have rebellion, which we don't see a lot in the UK. So we don't see a lot of kind of rebellion. So I'm just going to plug my computer in. But what we tend to see rebellion is it tends to formate in the form of music and art. So when we have rebellion in the UK, mass rebellion, it tends to be through music. So punk would be a good example of that. 1988, the advent of kind of rave culture would be an excellent example of that as well. And the last bit is kind of elite rebellion, and that's about smashing the order from within. So it's often elite traditionals who are rule breaking, and usually through sex, drugs, and kind of rock and roll, so to speak, but they're very hedonism, eccentric, and subversion of kind of the codes. So each of these codes has a best and kind of worst dimension. So mass traditional, at worst, they're the kind of people that are branded racist and kind of closed mind. At best, they're seen as community, family, fairness, and kind of down to earthness. Elite traditional plays into the upper classness. That can be about heritage, style, class, and tradition, but at worst, it can be seen as a snobbery, elitism, and about the empire. Your mass progressives is very much about universalism. It's about equality and fairness, but at worst, these could be the snowflakes. And even in a way, after gay rights, there wasn't that much more to fight for. This audience would kind of see, so they kind of shifted to mass consumerism. Your elite progressives is about protection of rights, protection of kind of liberalism, universalism, but at worst, it can be seen as a metropolitan elites that are very kind of patronizing. Mass rebellion, at best, it kind of drives big change. It's wild, fun, and subversion. At worst, it's riots, and it can be connected with the far left or the far right. An elite rebellion, which you don't see that so much of at the moment, it can be about style and class and breaking codes through fun and sex and drugs. But a kind of worse, it can be kind of connected to the far left or far right. So Diana Midford in the 1930s, who was an aristocrat who had strong connections with Hitler, would be a good example of that. Or the Cambridge Five, who were 5 people who worked in the Secret Service that betrayed secrets to the communists, would be an example of elite rebellion at its kind of worst dimensions. There's lots of different examples of this. So mass traditional this isn't where they necessarily come from, this is how they speak. So we have people like Nigel Farage, who's kind of part of leading the kind of Brexit. Priti Patel, who's the Home Office Secretary, very much talking the language of a mass judicial in the kind of pub, be tough on law and order. Kind of Norman Tebbit, even the boxer Tyson Fury would fit very much into this category. Elite traditional, not surprising, it's like the Queen and the High Church and Chelsea and kind of polo, but also politicians like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who lives in a castle and is an Anglo-Catholic, I think with 6 or 7 children and many mates. Then you have elite progressives. I think what's interesting about elite progressives is you get enemies who would be seen as enemies are actually in the same space. So Tony Blair and David Cameron are both elite progressives. They're both talking about the protection of kind of liberalism. John Major, similar. Harry and Meghan come from an elite traditional, or Harry has, to an elite progressive kind of space. Civil service is an example. Anne Appleton, who wrote a good book about kind of democracy, she's a pro-Reaganite, but she would be in this place because she talks about the protection of liberalism. Mass progressives, so we tend to get kind of sports stars very much in this kind of space, such as Gary Lineker and Anthony Joshua. Footballers like Marcus Rashford, we're talking about equality and kind of rights issues. Black Lives Matter, some of the conversations around that would have fit in here. LGBT rights, but generally when it works best, it's when it's a big movement, when you can shift the mass traditional into a mass progressive space. Thatcherism did that. She took the working class in the beginning ages and made them in much more mass progressive forward thinking. New Labour did that. Most of the voters of New Labour, I think 58% were from working class backgrounds. So they managed to achieve that middle ground. Mass rebellion, the interesting thing is this can come from many places. So you have Black Lives Matter and EDL, which is English Defence League, which is a far right organisation in the same kind of space. But often it comes into the form of music. So Rolling Stones, grime music, Summer of Love and punk. Elite rebellion, you don't see that much anymore, but I think Princess Diana was an example of someone who's rebelling, and you see it a lot in the form of past art, like the pre-Raphaelites and the Bright Young Things. Media plays into different kind of spaces. So your mass traditional is like your Daily Mail and your Sun. Your elite traditional is newspapers like the Telegraph and Spectator. Elite progressives, you tend to get the BBC, but also you get a lot of things you think are neither on the left or you think either on the left or right, but actually in the same space about this protection of kind of liberalism. The New Statesman, the Guardian, the Times and the Economist, all in that space. Mass progressives, you get things like ITV, which has probably shifted from a mass traditional to more mass progressive. They're talking a lot about kind of equality, a lot about kind of LGBT rights and other kind of issues to do with kind of diversity space. Mass rebellion tends to be your legal raves, which are coming back, a little bit of kind of Channel 4. And then elite rebellion, that could be for your social media groups, but also sex parties as well, which are often attended by people from the kind of aristocracy. Brands play into different kind of spaces. So mass traditional brands tend to talk a lot about kind of Britishness, things like your Iceland or your kind of Asda, but even charities like your Help for Heroes and your kind of your black cabs that you see in the street, very kind of icon of kind of mass traditionalism. Elite traditional talk about upperclassness, often with the stamp of the kind of Queen, or kind of talking about the kind of upperclassness of the states and the aristocracy. Barber is a great example of that, Rolls Royce. Elite progressives tend to be more technology brands or sustainability brands. So things like Body Shop, Airbnb would fit into that, Tesla, forward-thinking brands to do with the kind of to do with sustainability. Mass progressives, a lot of brands are operating in this space, and there's brands where they start to talk more and more about diversity kind of issues. IKEA is doing this very well. Unilever has done this with some of its kinds of brands. McDonald's, Football Association, number of brands playing into this kind of space. Then elite rebellion tends to be where you take elite traditional codes and twist it. So agent provocateur in a more kind of sexual kind of way. And then mass rebellion, you get traditional rebellion brands like Dr. Martens and Harley Davidson, but then other brands like Nike and kind of Bodyform would also be fitting in that. Bodyform for a lot of their work around kind of blood normal and womb stories, and Nike I think is just constantly played into this kind of space. So alliances work well when they occupy multiple kind of spaces. So if you look at the Brexit campaign, what that did was it was an alliance between mass traditional and elite traditional, and essentially in the culture war they positioned themselves as a mass rebellion. Remain couldn't really get itself out of being felt that it was an elite progressive, so it was easy to shoot down for many audiences seen as metropolitan elite, not for me. They should have moved forward into a mass progressive space, but they didn't do it. Black Lives Matter through the culture map, what you see here is it's an alliance very much about mass progressives and elite progressives, creating the feeling of essentially of a mass rebellion and a mass kind of need for change. But often the mass traditional, I've done quite a lot of work with this, will often reject Black Lives Matter for a number of reasons. In the UK, what you're seeing is a culture war being played out. So between mass traditional and elite traditional, and mass progressives and the elite progressives. A fantastic example of this was there's a program called Britain's Got Talent, which is on ITV, and it's a talent show. And on this, there's a dance band called Diversity, fantastic dance band, and they did a sketch about Black Lives Matter. It got the most complaints that a show's ever had, 24,000 complaints to kind of Ofcom, and that comes very much from a mass traditional baseline. But what you also saw was a lot of defence of it as well from other quarters, from the mass progressive and elite progressive space. The government at the moment, and arguably, is trying to push us into a culture war between these kind of divisions, and you're seeing that kind of played out. Surprise works well. So when you're a mass traditional brand like kind of Greg's, and you can talk in an elite progressive way, so you talk about vegan rolls, so your working class brand talking about something that elite progressives would probably like. The Daily Mail did this very well. It's a mass traditional newspaper, but it talks about Stephen Lawrence, who got killed by racists a number of years ago, and he really run the campaign. So that's moved into a much more mass progressive space. So now we're going to talk about how we've moved this kind of model kind of forward. And I'm going to pass over to Joe.
Hello. Yeah, so me and Steve, spent quite a while discussing this model and looking at how it manifests itself in culture. And I think the next step for us was to kind of not just examine the ways that this manifests itself, but kind of to ask the question, well, what's that reflecting? What's sitting underneath that model that we can quantify? So we used Global Web Index, which is a kind of international consumer insights tool, which is a big, legitimate kind of stack of quant data for us to do an analysis on, and really just started exploring at ways we could kind of make a model for who this kind of cultural framework is reflecting, and to kind of look underneath it, below the surface, and ask, like, well, are there groups that aren't reflected in that model, and how big are the groups that are reflected into that model? So we wanted to look underneath the kind of cultural codes and the semiotics into kind of how it is reflective of consumers or real people, if you want to think of them in that way. We wanted to do a very simple 2-axis model, and there was a lot of trial and error in this, in how we built out this audience to get something that felt like it reflected the model enough, but also was helping us develop and enrich our understanding and take it to a deeper place. So I'm going to introduce the model now and show you where we ended up after kind of a few rounds of trial and error. And as you can see, it's a 9-box grid. The horizontal axis is that kind of progressive versus traditional. And you'll notice there's another group in there as well. The pragmatics is what we ended up calling them. And that axis has been defined by, oh, I've lost the screen, Steve. Oh, has that gone for everyone else? I think it has. Yeah, that's better. It's back. Yeah, so, and that horizontal axis is based on values and their attitudes to tradition and progress, and the vertical axis is based on household income. So for the UK, we took kind of the top earners, and we define that as about £75,000 a year, which puts people in the kind of top 10% of income for the elites. And then at the bottom, we had the struggling group who are under £15,000 a year, and everyone else in the middle sits in that mass. So really simple 9-box way of segmenting the audiences. And on the next slide, I'll talk about how this is slightly different from the cultural codes model. So What we found, and I think this is particularly interesting for behaviour design and behavioural economics thinking, is that there's this large group who aren't captured in the cultural codes that we're calling pragmatic groups. And the reason that's interesting is because their decision-making processes don't seem to be driven so much by values, but seem to be more driven by pragmatism and simplicity, convenience. And I'll go on to talk about those guys in a little bit more depth in a moment. But it's just important to say that these aren't kind of neutral. They are a separate group who, they're not just sitting somewhere between traditional and progressives. They have distinct behaviours and distinct, you know, things that they care about. So that's the first shift that you'll notice. Obviously, the other thing that's immediately obvious is we added in this group that we're calling struggling, and I think it's no surprise that they're the group that feel like they're least reflected in the cultural codes that we all can kind of see around us and see reflected in the media and see reflected in the kind of thing that the news care about. These people who are, they kind of sit a little bit outside of the system. You know, they're not earning a huge amount of money and they struggle in their day-to-day lives. I know Steve does a lot of research into this group himself from a kind of qualitative perspective, so it was good to include those as well. And then finally, I think the thing you'll notice is that rebellion isn't being codified into a particular audience quadrant or group, and the reason for that is because, as you saw when we looked at the codes, any of these groups can shift into that rebellion space. And I think one thing that's starting to emerge from the analysis we're doing is that rebellion tends to happen when, you know, the kind of structure of culture itself isn't reflective enough of the people that sit beneath that kind of, you know, that cultural quadrant. So this is how this model differs slightly, but these things are very, very much meant to be seen as complementary, and they kind of have a relationship with each other. And, you know, exploring the kind of numbers of people and their beliefs underneath it has helped to kind of shed light on the cultural codes. So I'll jump into now and talk about some of the sizing. And this, I think we've lost the screen again. I think it might be something to do with clicking. I'm not sure. Yeah, so as you can see, this breaks down all 42 million UK adults into one of those boxes. And, you know, they're discrete for the sake of the model, but as with any good model, you know, there's going to be a degree of a spectrum within each one. But roughly speaking, you can see that the mass socioeconomic strata houses by far and away the largest number of people, number of respondents. The elite's much smaller. And then when you break down on values, what you can see is that the kind of pragmatic and traditional groups tend to dominate within each of those spheres, and the elite group's a little bit smaller. The more progressive group, sorry, is a little bit smaller. And I think that's interesting because when you look at the cultural codes, I think it's very much probably kind of equal in terms of the amount of volume they get culturally in each group between the progressives and the traditionals. As I said, the pragmatic groups don't feel like they're reflected quite as much in culture. And there's some interesting implications for that. And I think we'll come on to shed a bit of light on why we think that might be when we look at the ad industry in relation to these things, which I think is quite interesting. But before we get onto that, let's just kind of break down this audience a little bit more and show you the kind of analysis we can do. So just a really simple one to start off with, we looked at the breakdown between where they live. So if you look suburban versus urban, what you can see, and these charts are to scale with the previous chart, is what you can see is that there tends to be a skew for traditionalism in those more suburban environments and fewer progressives. But on the whole, you know, the majority of the UK still consider themselves living outside of urban centres. But that was just a simple thing to kind of introduce the model and show the kind of analysis that we can do. Then when you look at voting intentions, there's quite an interesting story here, which kind of rings true in terms of Labour and the left-wing kind of UK politics being much more defined by socio-economic group. And as you can see, you know, the majority of Labour voters fall into that mass category. There's also a skew, and they over-index as being part of those struggling groups. But in relation to those cultural codes and the culture war that Steve kind of illuminated a moment ago, what you can clearly see is that the Conservatives and the right wing of British politics what they're actually doing is leaning into values and culture much more heavily in order to kind of really own what traditionally you would assume would be a left-wing voting audience, that kind of mass traditional group. It feels like the Conservatives have kind of strategically really gone after that group, and that's something that's definitely accelerated after Brexit. I think we're seeing a kind of realignment of politics, not necessarily just on values, but certainly values is becoming a much more prominent determiner of people's voting intentions and how they identify politically. And that's something that's kind of fascinating, and it's you know, it's something that is going to benefit the more traditional. The more that culture and values are emphasized in politics, the more that's going to benefit the right wing of politics. I think is something that this chart kind of demonstrates. As you know, as when looking at the overall size of the groups, as you saw, the progressive groups are a minority in every category, and actually they need to take the pragmatics and some of the traditionals on that journey with them in order to win elections. So there's kind of political implications for this, and it's an interesting model for thinking about how political parties can better engage people to achieve power. And on the next slide, what we wanted to do was give a really clear example of where progressive values have kind of won out in the culture war. And the best example of that is in the UK, attitudes to traditional gender roles. So as you can see, this chart breaks down between those who think that traditional gender roles are not important versus those who are. And across all groups, there's a plurality, and there's a majority of people who don't see traditional gender roles as being important anymore. And I think this is a really, if you're of the progressive mindset, this is a really kind of heartening chart. Is something that kind of probably is going to make you feel quite good, because it's an example of when in that kind of battle for ideas and the battle for values and battle for cultures, gender roles clearly aren't seen as being something that's particularly important anymore. And I know Steve brought up Jordan Peterson and the kind of return to tradition. I think you can see that is resonating within that kind of, you know, Steve called it the magic third. That third of people much more skews towards traditional types, but there kind of is a third of people who reject that within each category, that reject that idea that gender roles shouldn't be important in defining people's lives anymore. But overall, I think what you can see is that the progressive ideas around gender have absolutely kind of achieved dominance and are kind of now the overall hegemonic code within culture. But then on the next slide, we're looking at an example where that isn't the case. And the first thing you notice here is that there's much more of a spread. And I think this is kind of playing back some of those points, which is as issues become more polarized, traditionalists and less progressive values tend to win out. And I think this is why the culture war as a concept is bad for progressives, because I think in general, and I want to talk about that in a few slides' time, but I think in general, progressives tend to overestimate their kind of the amount of the masses that agree with them on certain cultural issues, and immigration is one of those where, as you can see, there's a vast majority of people who would fall on that more traditionally conservative side of the fence, and they see immigration as a negative for the country that they live in. And I just want to kind of put a little bit of, you know, guardrails around this, because immigration has become a hot button issue. But if you were to ask questions such as, you know, do you believe in equality for everyone, or do you believe, are you interested in other cultures? Those kind of questions don't necessarily score so highly. I think immigration is something that has been weaponized really effectively by, you know, the more traditionalist conservative audiences in this culture war. So it's an interesting example to compare gender with immigration as kind of values-led concepts and issues that have got divergent matters of opinion across all those groups. But moving on, I want to deep dive a little bit more into what those groups are bound together by, the values that kind of hold these groups together, and then talk a little bit about what divides each group individually. So if you look at the progressive groups, I think across elites, mass and struggling socioeconomic kind of strata, they are all over-indexing on certain values-led statements. So personal ambition is big for progressives, and that's something that might be surprising, but they do value their career. They value kind of standing out in the crowd, and they want to achieve a lot for themselves. A big factor for them is adventure and travel, which is why you probably see brands like Airbnb playing in this space culturally. You know, they see experiencing and exploring the world and having a sense of adventure around life as a big part of their identities. Creativity, open-mindedness, technology. Again, these are values and things that, if you look at their behaviours, skew much more towards this progressive audience. And I think for behaviour design, that's important to know that they're the group that are most engaged in technology, and perhaps the kind of, if you're trying to tap into a progressive audience, technological initiatives and tech-led solutions are going to be very effective. And then finally, just a point on self-improvement. These people love podcasts. They love, I imagine the majority of people watching this conference probably fit into this kind of progressive mindset. They believe in learning, they believe in the value of education, and they believe that, that life is about kind of optimizing yourself. And that manifests itself not just through learning in the kind of more academic spheres, but also attitudes towards going to the gym, exercise, health, well-being, even things like mindfulness. I think much more skewed towards this kind of progressive mindset. But then we can look at what divides those socioeconomic strata. I think at the more elite end, there's much more of a focus on health. I think in my agency, Mother, we have this kind of phrase that we've used on a couple of clients, which is health is the new wealth. And I think that's a very progressive mindset. It's like when wealth is secured, moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you kind of get into the point where mental health, mindfulness, but also physical health is something that's a marker of being in that kind of top socioeconomic group. And their cultural interests are much more what you traditionally call high culture. So theatre, literature, elite cultural institutions. At the lower end of the spectrum, I think there's much more of a focus on entertainment culture, celebrity gossip, Instagram influencers, reality TV is big with this mass progressive audience. I think they like to see their lives reflected a little bit more in the type of content and culture they engage with. And then finally, this was an interesting one, but they're big into nature, and that might be going hiking or wildlife TV shows and things like that. But this kind of progressive group, not the elites, but the kind of mass, have got a real interest in kind of nature interests and experience in nature, which was quite interesting. So that's how those groups break down. Then when we look at the traditional groups on the next slide, these kind of across the strata, what you see is that they're kind of bound by values around family and the home. And that's values-led and attitudinal statements, but also they're kind of interest in DIY or gardening as pastimes and activities they're interested in. This sense of community is big for them, and helping others before themselves, faith and belief. These are all things that bind those groups. And I think faith and belief is interesting because when you look at the lower socioeconomic side of things with the struggling groups, what you do see is that they're interested in like alternative medicines and things like that, and alternative therapies are big amongst those groups. When it comes to what divide them, I think the elite traditionals are very worldly. They like to try wines and foods from around the world, and they do like to travel. They're more money driven. They're a bit more open-minded, despite seeing like traditional values as being something that they hold dear. And you don't see that in the lower socioeconomic groups, who are much more locally focused. But in the local groups, you do see some interesting things. So the mass and struggling traditional groups, the ones who are most tech averse, have any of the quadrants that we've identified. And they prioritize this kind of value of fair-mindedness and universalism. They really value fairness as a kind of foundational element within their identities. And then I think what became most interesting for me, because they're not captured so much in that cultural model, is the pragmatic group. So these people are kind of bound up in values of moderation, convenience, agreeableness, and kind of going with the flow a little bit. They don't want to kind of stick out. They're kind of conformist in nature. And I think as someone who works in the advertising industry, these are probably the people who are least on your radar. And actually for behavior design, this is interesting because they're probably the biggest audience, potentially speaking, for developing behavior design led thinking and behavior design led campaigns around, because they're less enamored with brands as a kind of fluffy, you know, emotionally driven thing. They want brands that are going to make their life easier. And then I didn't want to dwell too much on what divides this audience, because really there isn't much. They're not, that because of their inherently moderate nature, they don't over skew on any particular values. But one thing that was interesting when looking at the data, and perhaps quite surprising, as you would potentially have thought that, you know, ethnically diverse backgrounds might have fit more into the progressive value set, that isn't the case. And I think the thing that was so interesting to me was when you break down this data, actually the pragmatists are the most ethnically diverse group of all. And that becomes even more interesting because different ethnic backgrounds aren't distributed equally across the ladder. So what you see is certain ethnic groups perhaps being more socioeconomically well off and other groups being in that kind of struggling or mass category. And actually, on the next slide, I kind of pulled a quote from Reddit, which I'm not going to read through because it will take a while, but I think it captures a little bit of what gets to the heart of what makes this group tick, which is, and what they value about British culture, and perhaps the thing that isn't reflected in those kind of more cultural codes that Steve talked about, which is they really, really value the fact that there's a lot of things about British culture that if you're a kind of ethnically native Brit, you might not notice, which is stuff kind of just works. And the example that the guy kind of on Reddit was throwing up was traffic. You know, people stop for pedestrians at crossings and you don't have to bribe anyone when you take a driving test. Fairness kind of lands quite big, but I think what this group are really looking for is things that just aren't going to prevent them from getting on with their lives, and things that are going to make life easier for them. And I think that's why it's such an exciting audience for behaviour design. And it's an interesting one that it's not served by advertising, which tends to lean in the UK more into kind of emotional territories, which is going to resonate more with those other two audiences. And it, again, with like, you know, news and culture and the media is going to lean into those other two audiences as well, because those values type articles and TV shows and pieces of culture are going to be more likely to generate provocation and clickbait revenue. So yeah, just an interesting kind of quiet audience. Anyway, so there are three audiences, and then I just wanted to kind of toss a little bit of a grenade in here and like look at how those audiences are represented within the advertising, the media, the marketing, the journalist industry. So I kind of built an audience of marketing, media, journalism, arts, creative, culture, advertising, the kind of jobs and industries that are going to create those social codes that Steve talked about, and just have a look where you see a significant over-indexing. And unsurprisingly, the elite groups are the ones that are massively overrepresented in those jobs. So more than twice as likely as the general population to be working in those kind of careers and sectors. But also there's kind of a skew across the board to kind of more progressive values type people working in more creative industries. That's not a surprise. You know, being creative and open-minded, I think, is something that you would expect people who work in the creative industries to kind of have as a value that I identify with. But I think it does raise interesting implications for the kinds of blind spots that we might have as an industry, and the kind of viewpoints and identities that aren't necessarily being captured by the content and ideas and ways of thinking that permeate the industry. And that makes the next chart that we're going to show a little bit less surprising. So if you ask people, do they feel represented in advertising or do they not? As you can see, there's an absolute tiny minority of people who agree with the statement that advertising reflects them accurately, and those tend to fall in the kind of mass area. But the vast majority of people don't feel represented by advertising, and I think you can lay some of that some of the reason for that at the fact that it's such a homogenous group of people, and it's such a homogenous kind of handful of elite trending towards progressive people who are kind of shaping culture for the most part. Yeah, so that's kind of a top line of where the model took us in the UK. We've started to break that out and look at other regions, and it's something we can do using the tools that we have and kind of further break this down. But we first of all started to take a look at the USA. And as you can see, economically, it's a much more polarized culture. So there's far fewer people who make it into that elite group, and a vast majority of people kind of sit in the mass. But I think you see a similar story to the UK in terms of progressive pragmatics and traditionalists. But you know, we've only just started exploring where this analysis might take us. But yeah, there's a quick overview of the quantitative back end that kind of helps to explain a few of those cultural codes and why it might be interesting from a behavior design perspective.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Joe. That was a brilliant presentation. It was just so illuminating. I don't know how much time we have, but it was so interesting. There are so many questions. We'd love to discuss this. There is a question that I have, which is that, I mean, it's interesting because as much as you talk about, you've broken this down to culture codes in the UK, there's so much of it which is so familiar even back home. There's so much of it which seems extremely familiar. And Stephen, you spoke about how the good and the bad have shifted, and the idea of what we believed was good at some point, and who was a role model, and that seems to have changed and shifted. We've seen that here too. I remember back in the 80s or so, the hero in a film, in a Bollywood film, for instance, was someone who had a government job and was going to look after his family and going to get his sister married off, and it was things like that. And it's now more or less Deadpool, right? So there is a drastic shift. The whole celebration of the whole flaunting of flaws, that is something that that is also very here and now. I'm wondering, considering that these roles have shifted, considering that the mindset has shifted, who's influencing us now? Who are these new role models, and do brands have to now? Will brands also have to take these, make these shifts and start looking at archetypes from these new shifted angles?
I mean, I think the role model depends on where you sit in that model, to be honest. So people will like different things depending on the viewpoint of how you sit. So some people will want people that are more traditional, and the mass traditional will lean much more towards more traditional kind of roles, where I think the progressives will lean much more to someone who showcases herself in more progressive kind of way. I think what you need to look for is some kind of something that appeals to everyone, which is becoming more and more kind of difficult, and I think more and more difficult kind of globally. But I do think there's things like family values and fairness and respect. There's a number of values that you can play into to find that kind of architect type.
Me and Steve actually worked on a project together for a pitch, talking to, I guess, guys who you would consider in the mass and struggling traditional, trying to convince them to be more careful around gambling and to reduce their spend on gambling. And I think we had a very interesting set of insights around that, which was that when looking for kind of a hero character, those men, and they were mass traditional, mass struggling men, they wanted someone who had started off where they had started off, but had made it somewhere amazing. And they wanted someone they could empathize with in terms of their background, but had gotten to somewhere which they could only dream of achieving. And Steve talks a lot about the death of dreams. And I think there's a real opportunity for creating those kind of hero archetypes by looking at what people's dreams are, and through a character, giving people the opportunity to dream and like imagine what they could become. And I think that it's an interesting thing to try and think about, like, how have people's dreams changed how of what people like really, what would they love to be in their wildest dreams, and kind of like giving them the opportunity to do that when life and the world around them feels like there's less opportunity.
Right. It's really interesting, because I think, yeah, I mean, when brands traditionally tend to fall into the archetypes and say I'm the sage or I'm the hero, or but I mean, if the outlaw is the new hero, then who's the outlaw? And you know, if is it that, and also considering that you've broken down so beautifully into these different groups, and then do all of these, because it's become so diverse now, are we actually looking at a completely different frame of looking at personality types? Will we have, we've seen it, but will we have actual right-wing brands and left-wing brands? Are we going to see that kind of a shift?
It's a really good question, and I think what we focus a lot on here is what divides us. But I think for me, what's quite important is also what kind of unites us. So I do a lot of work in diversity space, and one of the things that we realized on diversity is, first, is really, if you want to bring people who are non-diverse and get them to buy into your advertising campaign, say you're featuring someone with disability or someone from LGBT, and they can't understand that background, the best place to play is in universal human values. So if you look at something like the Maltesers advert, what that is, it's a disabled woman, but she's with a bunch of friends which everyone can relate to, and she's talking about sex with her friends. If you look at Paddy Power, which used a disabled person, it's a disabled person who's supporting a football club. So I think what you want to look at is, you want to look at the universal values that unite us, and that for me is one of the key aspects for good campaigning, and that's when I think you can start uniting people. You know, sex, love, fear, there's so many, care, pride, and I think if you look at those universal values, then you can look for things that kind of can glue us together and can be used interestingly in campaigns. I mean, the Maltesers campaign that featured a disabled person was the best performing campaign in terms of sales for Mars for 20 years.
Wow. Okay. Stephen, Joe, we would love to just we've got our guests, and we've got so many questions. I would direct everyone to
Fantastic.
Weekend and to keep sending the both of you these questions. Get in touch with you on LinkedIn. I know I'm going to keep asking you guys.
That's good.
And thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.